We know the United States is losing the support of the Middle East. It has been going on for many years now. But if there's one moment that just rammed the final nail into the coffin, it happened last year. Now that was when President Biden he vowed consequences for Saudi Arabia. America didn't like the oil production cuts by OPEC and decided to teach MBS a lesson. Now what happened after that was the Saudis drifting closer to China and the BRICS. And in a stunning admission in the Pentagon leaks, it was revealed that MBS threatened economic pain on the United States. In a private conversation, MBS considered flipping the table on the US Saudi relationship if Biden retaliated against the oil cuts. Now, this pivotal moment accelerated the big shift towards Asia, and I dare say it might even be more important than the sanctions on Russia. Now, if you're Saudi Arabia, you suddenly realize that you're likely nothing more than just a gas station to the United States. If they ask you to pump more oil, you better pump more oil or else. Now, why do you think Saudi Arabia is diversifying away from the West? Just in the last 12 months, we have the Saudis looking to join BRICS and applying to join the BRICS Bank. But something big just happened. Saudi Arabia just hosted a historic Arab-China business conference in Riyadh. And picking up a story from Bloomberg, Saudis looks to China for business as US influence wanes. It's a rejection of America's diplomacy. Even Blinken has given up, telling the Saudis they are not forced to choose between the US and China. And listen to what the Saudi energy minister said during the business conference. We came to recognize the reality of today that China had taken a lead and will continue to take that lead. We don't have to compete with China. We have to collaborate with China. And this clearly shows the priorities of Saudi Arabia. They see China as the future, and all the actions they have taken so far are consistent with that belief. This is definitely not good news for the United States, and we must understand why. Now, this Arab China business conference comes on the back of Blinken's trip and just 2 months before the upcoming BRICS summit. So the Saudis are making a statement with this conference. And what MBS is doing is essentially slowly unraveling the historic agreement back in 1973. He is slowly dismantling the petrodollar system because it no longer serves Saudi Arabia's interests. Let's understand what the Saudi Vision 2030 plan is all about, right? This is MBS' master plan to develop his country into a regional power that goes beyond just producing and exporting oil. He is trying to aggressively expand the Saudi economy. And at the heart of this is to maximize their oil sales while the world still needs fossil fuels. Because sooner or later, guys, we are all moving towards renewables, so Saudi Arabia's oil revenues won't last forever. That's why Saudi Arabia has to develop and invest in their other sectors. We are talking about mining, technology, and renewable energy. Now, the Saudis can either do this with the Western powers like the United States, or they can do it with China and the BRICS countries. And what we have seen over the last 12 months is Saudi Arabia telling the world, hey, we believe the future is in Asia. We are going to invest in China and work closely with the global south. Now, just take a look at the trajectory of the Saudi-China trade versus that of the United States. Trade with China is heading up, crossing over $87 billion in 2021. That is at least 3 times more trade than with the United States. And this gap is just going to grow further and bigger over the next decade. And here's an even more important statistic. Saudi Arabia is running a huge trade surplus with China. They are exporting more than they are importing. In 2021, China exported $30 billion worth of goods to the kingdom, but imports from Saudi Arabia totaled $57 billion. So MBS is making a ton of money trading with the Chinese, and this gives China a lot of bargaining power in this relationship. And because the US no longer trades much with Saudi Arabia, he has lost a lot of leverage. What is left is just the defense pack. Now, what the kingdom is doing is focusing on building up their economy. They are doing whatever they can to protect their revenues. And we know this because MBS is pushing ahead with another production cut of 1 million barrels in July. The economy is suffering, but the Saudis no longer care. By cutting production, inflation will continue to stay high, and central banks could continue to hike rates even further. They are no longer listening to Washington, even if higher oil prices pushes America into recession. But why is Saudi Arabia investing so much money in China? Why are relations so good? This is where we need to travel back to 2017 when MBS decided to put Saudi Aramco, the national oil company of Saudi Arabia. He was moving to IPO the company, but there were no buyers. Investors didn't want to touch the company because they were afraid of the oil industry back then and Aramco's transparency about the oil reserves. But China, they did Saudi Arabia a solid. They offered to buy up 5% of Aramco directly, and this gave MBS confidence to go ahead with the IPO because there's now an underlying bid in the market if all else fails. Then, just before the actual IPO, China announced that they were considering investing up to $10 billion in the company. That was almost a third of the money raised. Once again, this gave confidence to this offering and allowed investors to bid up the price up to a record public offering. So the warm relationship between Saudi Arabia and China didn't really begin in 2022. It was developing for many years. So it's really no surprise that the kingdom is now investing heavily in China today. They value loyalty. And that's why back in March, Aramco announced two major refinery deals in China, supplying almost 700,000 barrels a day of crude to China directly. But let's talk about the Arab-China summit and the deals that went down, because you'll be able to see a trend. Now, the first day alone of the conference saw 30 deals being signed worth $10 billion. And on China's side, they are buying to commodity production in Saudi Arabia itself. $500 million were each signed for iron production and copper mining in the kingdom. China is trying to secure the raw materials needed to grow its economy and construction. Now, China's reopening now might be lagging behind today, but once they reopen, they need a steady supply of metals which will come from Saudi Arabia. And on the Saudi side, they signed the biggest deal of the summit. The Saudi government is investing $5.6 billion with a Chinese company, Human Horizons, to manufacture EV cars in China. Now, this is interesting because it's a Chinese company that I bet many of us has never heard of. This is more than Saudi Arabia's additional investment into American EV maker Lucid Motors. MBS is trying to get into the EV game and he's stepping it up in China. So the winds are clearly shifting towards the east. Saudi Arabia isn't just selling more oil to China, it's happening in the investment world as well. But let's circle back to the oil markets because something big just happened there. Now, one of the world's biggest oil producers just sold their crude cargo to another country outside of dollars. Putting up a story from Reuters, Pakistan paid in Chinese currency for discounted Russian oil. And the deal consists of 100,000 tons of Russian crude oil, of which 45,000 tons has already docked in Pakistan. This new trade deal is beneficial for both Russia and Pakistan for different reasons. Now, for Russia, selling their oil exports in the Chinese yuan is a no-brainer, right? They have been cut away from the US dollar system, so they don't really have a choice there. Now, Russia is de-dollarizing their own economy by aggressively using the Chinese yuan in its trade and external trade as well. Now, in February this year, the yuan surpassed the dollar for the first time in history as the most traded currency in Russia. And ever since the sanctions hit Russia in 2022, we can see a divesting of US dollar trade to the Chinese yuan. And for Pakistan, the move away from dollars is just as urgent, but for very different reasons. They aren't really under US dollar sanctions, so why are they running to the Chinese yuan? What is really going on? It's because Pakistan has a huge US dollar shortage crisis. They only have enough dollars to cover just 1 month of imports. Remember that we still live in a highly dollarized world. Almost everything, especially commodities, are priced in the reserve currency. It doesn't matter if you're from China, Japan, or Germany. If you want to buy commodities, you have to transact in dollars. Because Pakistan has a huge trade deficit, they don't have enough dollars coming to their economy. They don't have the ability to print dollars like the Federal Reserve, so they can't run such huge deficits without encountering a crisis. And their dollar reserves have been falling from over 25 billion to under $10 billion. And that's a crash from 3 months worth of imports to under 1 month, less than 30 days. So if they can't raise any more dollars, it's kaput for their economy. And things are so bad, guys, that Pakistan is renting out its Roosevelt Hotel to New York City to raise $220 million in cash. It is being used for immigrant housing in New York. But Pakistan has no choice. And that's maybe the fanciest housing I've ever seen for migrants and asylum seekers. So we can understand why Pakistan is moving away from dollars towards the Chinese yuan. If not, they have to print tons of rupees to buy dollars, which will cause hyperinflation back home. And here's the interesting thing. China is actually subsidizing Pakistan's trade. China is increasing the size of their currency swap lines with Pakistan by 10 billion yuan, which is around $1.5 billion worth. And this means China were taking Pakistan rupees, which are dropping in value, in exchange for more stable yuan to buy Russian oil. Now, Pakistan has no swap lines with the Federal Reserve. they aren't on the favored list, so they can't access US dollars freely for their imports. So what we are seeing is the dollarization happening in commodities, especially in the emerging markets. We have Russia now selling their oil in yuan. It's not a stretch that sooner or later Saudi Arabia could also do the same. They could start pricing their oil in yuan, especially to exports within Asia and the BRICS nations. Now, a key weakness the US dollar has is restricting access to the reserve currency. Looking at the list of swap lines with the Federal Reserve, only a handful of countries have unlimited access to US dollars, and this includes Canada, the UK, Japan, and the Eurozone. And this is how it works. If you face a shortage of US dollars, you can swap out your own currency like the British pound for US dollars with the Federal Reserve. However, it's obvious that there are very few emerging markets on this list, except maybe for Brazil and Mexico. And this is where things get really interesting. If Saudi Arabia prices their oil exports in yuan, China can encourage countries to pay in yuan by extending more swap lines. And this move is powerful because now China can drive demand for both their currency and oil from Saudi Arabia. It's a win-win proposition for everyone. And remember what the kingdom's finance minister said earlier in Davos this year. They are open to settling trade in other currencies. They aren't bound to only the US dollar. So it's just a matter of time before OPEC prices oil in yuan or other currencies. And now we have further confirmation that Saudi Arabia's alliance with China is only going to grow. The Saudis see themselves and China as key players in a multipolar world. And these next two statements are groundbreaking because it tells us the shift towards a new world order is coming. There's no stopping this train. And according to the Saudi Minister of Investment, the kingdom is a significant part of this multipolar world that has emerged. We are spreading what we have in terms of development opportunities also to Africa, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. What we are witnessing is a historic pivot from the West to Asia, and Saudi Arabia is going to work with China to develop the rest of the world. And he confirms this with this stunning statement. We see opportunities for Chinese companies and Saudi companies to also invest internationally in third countries. We are no longer dependent on the developed north in the previous world order. So let's recognize the inevitable. It's just a matter of time, guys, before OPEC oil gets priced outside of dollars. The dollarization will likely start in the commodity markets first before it happens elsewhere in the debt markets. So China's strongest weapon is its economy. We know that. The stronger the Chinese economy is, the faster they can push the de-dollarization train. Now America won't be sitting back and twiddling their thumbs doing nothing, right? Because they know China's biggest weakness is the supply of commodities. Around half of China's oil comes from the Middle East alone, which is a big vulnerability point. In fact, the US has been considering the possibilities to counter China's rise in the event of a conflict. In a hearing in March this year, General Kurilla told Congress that they could mobilize CENTCOM, which is the US military in the Middle East, to potentially block China's oil supply. And according to him, God forbid there's ever a conflict with China, but we could end up holding a lot of their economy at risk in the CENTCOM region. So America does have options to curtail China's oil supply if push comes to shove. They could blockade any energy shipments to China as a last resort move. And this is the real point of weakness in the Chinese supply chain that we can't ignore. That's why China is brokering peace in the Middle East and getting the Gulf states to trade more with China. They are encouraging the Arab states to invest in China and for China to invest in the Middle East as well. So if there's any conflict between US and China, the Arab states will be affected. And China's economic strategy is just more cost effective than America's military strategy, which is actually bleeding the US economy dry. Now, if Saudi Arabia really prices their oil outside of the dollar, then ass will really hit the fan. It will accelerate the dollarization further, but understand that the US still has many tricks up their sleeves. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Can Saudi Arabia change the world order? Will they move away from the dollar? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.